No discussion of network services would be complete without talking about the Inetd service. Inetd is usually found on Unix implementations such as BSD, Solaris, and so forth, but you also might see the Inetd service in Linux, and it does the same thing and is used the same way. For the purpose of our discussion, we'll be talking about Inetd, but understand that Inetd is basically the same thing. Now, Inetd is known as the super server, and the reason it's known throughout the Unix and Linux community as the super server is that it's responsible for managing multiple services, network services, and it controls access to them. It determines who, as in what user and what host, are allowed to access which service from the network. And it can control access to these services by host name, by username, by IP address, and so forth. And it uses a concept called TCP wrappers to secure these services. Now, we'll go into more depth about TCP wrappers later on in the course when we cover network security, but understand that TCP wrappers is part of Inetd. Now, Inetd also uses several network configuration files. Some of them we've already talked about, such as the etc services and protocols, the host.allow, and so forth, to manage these files, to manage these services so that it can determine who's allowed to do what to what service. Now, the configuration file that the Inetd service uses is inetd.conf, and although it requires this file to be read to know what to allow and what not to allow and how to allow it, the Inetd service itself is started in rc.conf. When the init process kicks up and runs rc.conf, Inetd, if it's configured properly, is started through the rc.conf file, and that in turn uses the inetd.conf configuration file to run. So we'll go ahead and take a look at a few of these files, and we'll look at the Inetd man page just so you can see what some of the options are with this service. Okay, the first thing we want to do in our FreeBSD 8 virtual machine here is let's go ahead and look at man Inetd. And Inetd is a service, as we said, but it can be ran with several options. We can run it from the command line, and there's several options that we can attach to it. Now, the Inetd utility itself is normally run at boot time, and again, it's run by etc rc, and it's usually in the rc.conf files where it starts up. So there's some options here that we'll take a quick look at, such as turning on debugging, that's a -D. We can also log successful connections, and we might want to do that to determine who is accessing our network. We can do this periodically to check and make sure that unauthorized hosts or users are not accessing our services. We can also turn on TCP wrappers here, and again we'll talk about TCP wrappers a little bit more in the course, but we can turn them on for external services and internal services. TCP wrappers provide security for Inetd. Now, we can also set the maximum number of connections to each services by certain hosts and certain users, and we can also specify the rate that these services are invoked, in other words turned on, so that we don't have malicious users or malicious hosts out there trying to initiate large numbers of connections to these services and thereby causing a denial of service condition with our computer. So there's some security built in here into Inetd, and we can specify that when we run it. We can also hand these options off, these flags as it were, to Inetd through the inetd.conf file, which we'll look at in just a moment. So these are some of the options out there, and there's several of them out there, and you probably need to get very familiar with some of them before you start messing around with your Inetd and inetd.conf. Let's go ahead and take a look at inetd.conf now. As I said, this is the primary configuration file for Inetd. Now here you've got a lot of stuff commented out. Basically how this works is you uncomment the things you want to run, and you've got some basics already in here, but you can add protocols to this, but they must be located in etc services in order to be used. So if you have a strange or unusual protocol or a non-conventional protocol, you need to add it to etc services and possibly etc protocols as well. Protocols that you see here are very basic, so they've set you up with basically a template file that you can uncomment and massage a little bit to get what you want out of it. We see entries for secure shell, for telnet, finger, and so forth, and there's a lot of them out there. But you'll see an entry for protocol, the protocol type that it is, TCP. You also want to know whether it's a streaming protocol or a raw protocol, whether it invokes a wait or no wait option, and all of these options are explained in this file. This is actually a very well put together file, and if you read through it and use some of the examples, you should be able to configure a very good inetd.conf file without having to do a lot of research. But it's a very easily configured file as long as you know what you're doing, and you have to be very careful about what you turn on and off in this file, because this file does determine what network services are accessible from users on the network and how they work. So you have to be kind of careful and do a little research before you start playing around with this. Now, as we said before, Inetd service has to be started up in rc.conf when the init process starts up the RC services. So you're going to want to put an entry, if you enable Inetd, in the rc.conf file. Basically, inetd_enable equals yes in rc.conf, and that's actually very easy to do. You can do that manually, or as we're going to see in our next session, how we can install services such as Inetd through sysinstall. So we've basically given you a down and dirty on Inetd and inetd.conf.